Hi, welcome to Faith and Culture Now. This week, my guest is Rabbi Shira Wallach. Rabbi Wallach, thank you so much for being here. It's good to have you.
Thank you, Scott, for inviting me. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah, as we begin, would you mind telling us a little bit about just who you are and what you do?
Sure. So I'm a rabbi, which means I'm a spiritual leader for a Jewish congregation. I have a pulpit at a synagogue called Congregation Shiras Israel here in Dallas, Texas. And this is my 8th year out in the field. I was ordained as a rabbi in May 2013, along with my husband. And we actually are 2 out of the 3 rabbis on our team at Shiras. So it's been such a blessing to be able to work with him, to share our partnership, and also create beautiful and sacred relationships with community. I do all the normal quote unquote pulpit rabbi stuff like life cycle events and teaching and leading prayer. And I also focus a lot of my work on the young family community, on building those connections, both with the parents and the kids and the family units. And I help educate our children in our religious school. And I'm always thinking about different ways of educating our members of all ages. I just love being part of the educational process. And I'm also musical. I sing and I play guitar. So I also think a lot about the spiritual experience in terms of music. And I love bringing new modalities, new musical approaches to our prayer. I will say in this time of the pandemic, as I'm sure other faith communities have felt, it's been challenging to triumph over these screens that we have in front of our faces when we're so used to gathering as a community and feeling support from one another. When we need to tap into these experiences of both support, when we're grieving, and also the joy when we're celebrating. It's really hard to recreate that online, but we're all doing our best and bringing our best creativity to the fore.
Yeah, very good. A number of years ago, a number of Baptist pastors didn't really like the idea of churches beginning to stream their services online. They wanted their members there in person. And so I remember a number of pastors saying things like, this technology is so bad. And now that the pandemic's here, they're like, hey, this is pretty good. This is helpful. And it's like, oh, way to change your tune. But
We've
not
had,
ideal,
of course,
but
similar conversations.
yeah. Not ideal, but at least helpful. You mentioned some of your focus being on families and kids and helping them learn about the faith. What is, in your mind, the importance of community in Judaism?
Oh, that's such a good question to start with. Judaism, of course, is a faith that can be practiced on an individual basis, but it really comes alive when you're in community. I mentioned prayer before, and one of the ways that we bless God, there are certain categories of prayers that you can say when you're alone. And then
Hmm.
there are other categories of prayers that you can only say when you're with a quorum of 10 Jews or more. And that's because we believe in the power of communal prayer, that when we join our voices together, that our voices are louder. The cumulative power of that is something that God just can't ignore. And then everything else, that we celebrate, we do in community, and that of course brings it up to the next level. I mean, can you imagine celebrating a wedding without the context of community, without like that raucous noise and the joy and the dancing and the hubbub? Like that's what makes it feel so special. And then when we mourn a loss, when we bury someone, when we remember someone, you have to be surrounded by the love of community. And so, it's even more painful now that we've had to explore different ways to compensate for that in the pandemic.
Hmm.
And yes, I mean, you can do a lot of things online, but there's really nothing like the sound and the feeling and the comfort that you get from presence of others.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you. Well, as we sort of get going more into the interview, would you sort of, in your own words, briefly define Judaism as you see it?
So it's such a big question. So I'll start just by answering it in terms of identity. So Judaism, I think, is both a religion and an ethnicity. People identify as Jews in all kinds of ways. I mean, there's the definition of the Jew that is a regular in synagogue and really identifies with a tradition and loves their Hebrew name and loves to be called to the Torah and all of these ritual roles. And then there are the people that identify with Judaism in cultural ways, like we might use like the lox and bagel Jews, like the people that really take a lot of delight in the food and the history and the music, the ties to the state of Israel. Like those are the ways in. Um, and in this day and age, and when we're really exploring, what a diverse Jewish community can feel like, we take into account the Ashkenazic Jews, the Jews that come from Eastern Europe and look like me. And then there are the other Jews, the Sephardic Jews that come from Western Europe, that come from Ethiopia, that come from other parts of the world that bring their own language and culture and food and music and all this stuff. So Judaism, I think, is a beautiful combination of history and identity and prayer, and tradition. And in that way, Judaism is this beautiful, multifaceted experience. I work in the conservative movement, so that's a big C conservative as opposed to small C conservative. Um, it's a little bit confusing. We don't identify politically conservative. The reason why my movement is called conservative is because we try to conserve, the traditions of the past while also being open to the vision and the morality of the future. And so I'm sure we'll get to this in a couple of questions, but there are different movements in Judaism. Conservative Judaism kind of finds itself in the middle of this, of this line of observance, I suppose, where you go more to the right and that's more of an orthodox approach, or you go more to the left and that's more of a reform approach. The conservative movement tries to pin down the middle, how it is that we see ourselves as at the crossroads of tradition and change. And so when we talk about like, what is Judaism, or how would you imagine an approach to Judaism? Movement figures a lot into it, identity figures a lot into it, history figures a lot into it. It's basically an entire lifestyle that you plug into, a community of the past and the present and the future. And that's one of the things that really drew me to being a rabbi, because Judaism is it's just so beautiful, and it's all its different ways of inviting somebody in.
Yeah, it's sort of from what you explained, it's kind of like you guys are trying to preserve the importance of the past, but you're also trying to help people continue to move forward as life brings new challenges and as cultures continue to shift and change.
Exactly. Like Judaism is a biblical religion, and that the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, are the textual core of everything that we do. But that whole religion was centered around a temple that we no longer have access to because it was destroyed. And even the second temple that was rebuilt was destroyed. And so the rabbis, in about the 1st century of the Common Era, had to completely reinvent this religion. And so, of course, we have our biblical ties, and that's really where we see ourselves in terms of our history. But rabbinic Judaism is really what our religion is, giving us, all the rhythms of the day and the holidays and the laws that we follow, and our laws of kashrut, are what we can and we can't eat, for example. That's what gives our modern Judaism its color, because what's so integral to rabbinic Judaism is its dialectical form. You're not going to open our earliest rabbinic conversations and get conclusive law about, this is what you ought to do when and how and why. You get conversation between rabbis, between teachers, trying to figure out what is the role of the Jew in the modern world. That we don't have access to the ancient temple anymore. So how is it that we frame our connections, our relationships, how it is that we lead sacred lives?
Yeah, very good. It's like people oftentimes like everything to be black and white. You do this, you don't do this, and in reality, life is a lot more messy than that. And so
Absolutely
the
right.
nice thing about the
I
Talmud,
love
yeah,
that.
is that,
And
you've got these conversations with these rabbis who are saying, I think this and I think this, and there's not always a clear answer, but that allows for interpretation, that allows for contextualization, and it allows for you to take certain principles and then sort of reapply those principles as situations change. I think we sort of go through something very similar in Christianity. There are certain beliefs that I think we have that are very, this is the belief. But then there are a number of issues where, you'll have multiple denominations in Christianity that do things differently because they see and understand in Scripture how to do that differently. And so these things are, if you're a member of a certain denomination, you may think this is the only way to do it. But when you look at the reasoning behind why other people do it differently, sometimes they have very good reasons. And then you sort of have to wrestle with, okay, well, now are we doing it wrong? Or are they doing it wrong? Or is it that both of these ways are acceptable? Or perhaps neither way is acceptable and we're both incorrect? So,
Yeah, I mean, Judaism approaches the world, I think, with a humility that there is no absolute truth, that you get the truth in a conversation, and that ends up being more important than the answer. Sometimes my congregants will ask me, like, what does Judaism say about X?
uh-huh.
Judaism never says one thing about X.
Mhm.
You should say, like, what is the conversation that Judaism has about X? Because that'll get you closer to the truth.
Yeah, very good. Well, what are some of the major beliefs of conservative Judaism?
Oh, of conservative Judaism specifically.
Mhm.
Well, conservative Judaism, as I said before, is about tradition and change. So it
Mhm.
looks at our textual precedent and it conserves as much as it possibly can. But when it bumps up against modern um, values of morality, that's where we start to introduce the change. So one of the things that you'll see that you'll be able to contrast between conservative Judaism and more traditional strands of Judaism is our gender egalitarianism. So
Mhm.
I'm a rabbi and I'm a woman. I wouldn't be able to serve as a rabbi in the vast majority of Orthodox communities because
Mhm.
in Orthodox Judaism, it's not gender egalitarian. Men are often appointed as the leaders of communities, whereas women have different roles. Conservative Judaism, here I am. We also are more open than more of the sects, more of the movements on the right in terms of not just gender egalitarianism, but for the LGBTQ community. We are more embracing of interfaith families than the Orthodox movements. But if you wanted to contrast us with the Reform movement, that's to our left,
Mhm.
they have a different relationship with halakha, with Jewish law, than we do. Conservative Judaism is still a halachic movement, which means that we base all of our conversations and our decisions in the precedent of Jewish law. So that's
Mhm.
our frame of reference. That's always where we start. In terms of, what are the basic tenets of Judaism as a whole, I would say, one of the ideas that we hear over and over again in the Torah and the 5 books of Moses is that because we were once slaves in Egypt, that we have to, now that we are no longer slaves, what we must do with our newfound power and agency is to make sure that no one else is ever oppressed. We hear this, it's like a refrain in the Torah.
Yeah.
So that's one of our undergirding principles, that as we look out into the world, how do we use our power? How do we use our voices? Now that we're free, is we have to protect others that might be oppressed. And then the other part is love, and this is one of the things that I know is really important in Christianity as well. The love of God is that grace that we find in our relationship with the divine.
Mhm.
This too is a mantra that we hear over and over in the Torah. We have to love the stranger. We have to love one another, and we love God. And it's only after we learn how to love one another is then we get in the book of Deuteronomy, the Ahavta is love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might. And everything else is commentary. All the other laws, all the other ways that we are commanded to interact with God and with other people, those are all ways that love is manifest. That's how
Mhm.
we bring the world to a more perfect place. One other way that I describe the way that biblical religion gives us a framework for the world is the story of creation. So God, a perfect, eternal, omnipotent, omniscient being, could have just lived out all of eternity, without creating us. But there was something about God's existence that was incomplete. And so God made the decision to bring us into existence. And I believe that's because God needed us as partners. that God needed to figure out how to bring other beings into the cosmos, because God needed to explore all of the messiness that we would bring, because we're not angels. We have free will. We have propensity for good, and we also have propensity to evil. God knew that bringing us into existence, but chose to do it anyway, because God needed our help. One of the really big ideas in Judaism is tikkun olam, which means repairing or fixing the world. And I believe that God made the choice to bring people into existence in order to embark on that particular sacred journey.
Yeah, that makes sense. In Christianity, I think we sort of look at the creation story a little bit differently. However, we also see that, God created people for community, and he created us as stewards of all that is his, and all in the world is his. And so our responsibility is to care for all of creation, including plant life, animal life, and other human life. And so, yeah, very much sort of at least along the same lines. So.
Yeah, that idea of stewardship is so important. That we as people have dominion over the earth, but that means that we have that sacred responsibility. Absolutely.
Yeah, very good. Well, you've already mentioned the Torah, and you've mentioned that the Jewish rabbis got together in the first century, and we have their recorded conversations. That's the Talmud. Are there any other sacred texts that you guys use, or that you guys give a lot of, I guess, credence to?
Oh, what a big question. Yeah, Judaism lives very much in text. So of course we always go back to the 5 books of Moses and the rest of the Hebrew Bible. On top of that, like you mentioned, the Talmud, which, is this huge oral tradition that encompasses the Mishnah, which is, those first conversations that take place between about, 0 and 200 of the Common Era. And then the commentary on that, which was closed, maybe in the 5th or 6th century, the Common Era. So in addition to those dialectical type texts, we also have the law codes, because at a certain point you need to know what the law is. You don't want to flip through pages and pages of conversation to figure it out. So we have rabbis in the 10th, 11th, 12th centuries that distill the contents of the conversations into law codes, so that you can look up, what happens when you want to cook something that's meat and a little drop of dairy falls into it by accident. You have to figure out what to do. You can look that up. Other kinds of texts that we lean on a lot are midrash. Midrash is commentary on the Torah, whose goal is not law, but whose goal is to just explore certain ideas or certain themes through the power of story. Sometimes, if you need to ask really important questions, but you're afraid of saying something that might be a little bit blasphemous, shocker, sometimes religious people have doubts, in their faith. Sometimes you have to explore those kinds of, problematic ideas through story, so that you can create a little bit of emotional distance between the speaker or the teacher and what's going on in the story. So we have volumes and volumes of midrash that span all the way, from the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, really up until now. There are still modern scholars that are constantly writing new forms of midrash. And we also have, rabbinic commentators that are always trying, in generation after generation, coming up with new writings to tease new meaning out of our ancient texts. Finally, of course, there are so many different texts I could talk about. The last genre that I'll tell you about are called responsa. So we mentioned before that Judaism is very much about text, about law, about legal precedent. But especially in my movement, we try to intersect between the tradition and modernity. And sometimes questions will come up for which there is no precedent. The Bible would never be able to think about a world where we come together to pray on Zoom, nor could the early rabbis. There's no legal precedent for that. So we have questions that we submit to legal experts in, rabbis who study Jewish law, and they write these responsa that they're then voted on to be ratified by, our law committee. And then those kinds of documents help us navigate how it is that we're going to move forward. because the conservative movement is so focused on living in the text, but determined to make the text a living document. So we always have to ground everything we do in precedent.
Yeah, that makes sense. The midrash stories, it sort of reminds me of fables, if you will, where there are these stories that are meant to teach moral lessons without just explaining the lesson. And I think even in Scripture, you find examples of this. In I think it's Judges. You have the story where all the trees get together to elect which tree is going to be the king over all the other trees of the forest. And clearly that's not actually happening, but it's a story in Scripture that is meant to teach a lesson for what the Israelites are going through during that particular time between going into the Promised Land and having Saul ordained as king.
Right. I mean, fables and midrash, and even these stories that are in the Bible itself. There are so many different kinds of tools that our traditions offer for teaching.
Yeah.
And stories are such an emotional and profound way to teach the things that are the most important to our religions.
Yeah, very good. Well, and it also sort of makes sense with, a lot of ancient societies, right, were very story oriented and, just with oral traditions and other things of that nature. And so to keep that as part of what you do now, I think is important because it also is sort of another link to all the things that you're building your foundation upon.
Absolutely.
So very good. Well, what are some things that might want someone to, or might cause someone want to convert to Judaism today?
Oh, good question. So a lot of the time, we have people that are interested in converting because they want to marry somebody Jewish.
Uh-huh.
Um, so that often brings folks in. Other times, it's people that have grown up with different faiths and feel like their relationship with their faith broke in some way or never really laid right with them. And then they
Mhm.
come to Judaism and then feel like they are found. Sometimes they bump up against a certain belief or tenet or practice that, it doesn't really make sense in their world. And then the
Mhm.
way Judaism offers them a different space, is compelling. I've also heard from students who take our Intro to Judaism class that they love that Judaism really encourages questioning, whereas
Mhm.
their faith tradition that they grew up with might have not allowed them so much to ask questions or to express doubt and faith, and Judaism loves the questions, loves the doubt, because we believe, you really don't know what true faith is until you have broken faith, and then you have to build it back up again.
Yeah, it's a spiritual growing experience. And I agree that I think questioning things is very important because if you never question anything, you can't really know how much you really are committed to the belief. And
Absolutely. Yeah,
uh,
couldn't have said it better myself.
there are a number of religions out there that do very much discourage. And in fact, I know of a couple of faiths that will tell their members, if you even explore another faith, that's enough to get you cursed for eternity. And you're going, oh, that's not healthy. I mean, we should be able to look at other faiths, and sometimes looking at other faiths helps you understand your own better and even helps you be more encouraged in your own faith. And so, certainly, the questioning is important. Well, on the flip side, what are some things that might be stumbling blocks or be things that would prevent someone from wanting to embrace Judaism?
Yeah, also a good question. So Jews have a really difficult history, where in
Hmm.
every generation, in every place that we've lived, we've had to encounter persecution in some way or another. So that's sometimes a really difficult thing for people to wrap their heads around. It's, even like the Shoah, the Holocaust is still very fresh in our collective history and memory. So that's something very difficult to contend with. Although on the other hand, it can be kind of a unifying idea for people to like need community in order to feel comforted from that.
Hmm.
Judaism also, um, like I said before, is about a lot of laws. There's a lot of practice that goes along with being an observant Jew, like prayer 3 times a day, like keeping kosher. We're not allowed to eat milk and meat together and shellfish. And, some people find that to be very difficult. But also there are varying levels of observance, particularly in conservative Judaism. So there's, a whole continuum between those who like take upon those laws in their strictest sense versus who are more lenient. But Judaism, people I think can find their portal into it. There are so many different ways of feeling connected. So I think that there are fewer barriers than there are entry points.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think when it comes to the idea of like laws, right? There's a lot of laws, there's a lot of legality, but I think in any religious group, you tend to create legal issues over time, right? I mean, whether you have the Torah law or another book, and just traditions bear, when they become uh, set in stone, they bear certain responsibilities that become sort of like legalities in different faiths. But the nice thing about that is that most people like to, at least some degree, having a set of things to follow, a guideline to sort of gauge where they're at on the spectrum. And so even though, I think some could look at the law and go, oh my goodness, this is like 600 plus things. How do I deal with this? But others may look at it and go, this is very clear. This is very laid out. And it's comforting to be able to have a good understanding of how I should act and behave, as a practitioner of this.
I love that. And that's another reason why I love Judaism, is because it gives us choreography for everything. Every day, week, month, year has a cycle to it, has a rhythm to it. And I kind of love that. And people who love structure can find a lot of comfort in that too.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think, in Christianity, you might hear Christians say something like, well, we're no longer under the law, which is sort of true. But then when you look at the writings of the New Testament, what is taught there is that the law is fulfilled, but that doesn't negate the goodness of doing a lot of the things in the law. And so, the way you know how to obey God is through the law. And so even the New Testament writings say, you're not trying to work your salvation out by keeping the law, but because you love God, you follow his commandments.
Mm-hmm.
And so the idea, even in Christianity, is there's sort of a precedent on how to act and how to live ethically and how to live spiritually that allows you to be drawn closer into your relationship and your walk with God.
Right. Like we don't follow the commandments because we're afraid we're going to get like struck down with a lightning bolt.
Right, right.
We obey the commandments because we believe that that's a manifestation of our love for God, that we believe that this is the blueprint God has given us,
Mm-hmm.
make the world a better place, to use a cliche, but
Yeah.
that's ultimately why somebody would buy into a religious life.
Yeah, and we would argue that God is ultimately perfectly good, right? He's perfectly good, and as such, everything he does is best for his creation. I mean, he created us, and then has our best intentions in mind in that creation. And so, if he's put certain laws and practice into place, they're not for our detriment, but they're for our good. They're to protect us. They're to provide for us. They're to keep us from doing harmful things to ourselves and to others, and so on. I mean, so when you look at a lot of these things, a lot of these different laws, the idea behind them all is still they're for our own good. And so, God's not saying, I'm trying to kill your joy. He's saying, you'll have the best life possible if you do the things that I've prescribed for you.
Right. And I think keeping that in mind is important also as we, try to preserve our tradition in the context of modernity.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you believe that the Bible is literally the word of God or whether you believe that it was divinely inspired, we know that, we could assume that the most of the biblical authorship and all of its subsequent scholarship have been written by men. And
Mm-hmm.
so as we try to pave a path in the world that you just talked about, that has everybody's best interests at heart, we have to be able to bring new voices into the conversation who aren't cis men, who who can read these laws and these rabbinic writings and say, this is how we bring everybody to the table. This is how our new interpretations can make sure that that we can live out the vision of Genesis, that every single person is created in the image of God, and we treat them as if they are created in the image of God.
Yeah, yeah, very good. Well, just a couple more questions today, and the first is, what do conservative Jews think about salvation and what happens at the time of death?
Yeah, I love this is so interesting. So Judaism, in contrast to other religions, doesn't spend a lot of time talking about the afterlife. We are much more focused on what happens here in this life because we don't know what happens next. And so we don't tell people to make choices in this life based on what kind of afterlife they want to have. We encourage people to be very present in this life. So in terms of salvation, like it's not like a black and white, you're either going to be damned for eternity or you're going to be saved. We believe, in the autonomy that we have in every moment to make good choices. I mean, so Judaism believes in like a good intention and a bad intention, like the angel and devil like sitting on your shoulders, but it's the Yetzer Hatov, which is our proclivity toward good, and the Yetzer Hara, which is our proclivity toward evil. And we know that we are perfectly aware that at all times we have both of these voices battling inside of us. And so we have to make choices all the time based on our moral code toward the Yetzer Hatov, like toward the good inclination. And so we have these moments of, where we stay on the straight and narrow, or we have moments of deviation, but we always have a path back to center. I spoke before about our daily, weekly, monthly, yearly cycles, right? So one of our yearly cycles starts on Yom Kippur, which is our Day of Atonement. It's the 10th day of our year, right? Like 10 days after we celebrate Rosh Hashanah, our new year. And we spend this whole day, we fast, we pray, we think about everything that we've done wrong. And we come together in community, and it's this very powerful thing where we all confess together, and then we're all kind of exonerated together, and we can start the year with a clean slate. And that happens once a year, but also incorporated into our thrice daily prayer is a shortened version of that kind of confession and then exoneration. So we don't believe that, sin makes us inherently bad. We believe that when we deviate from the path, that actually gives us a sacred opportunity to do teshuvah, which is the Hebrew word for repentance or return, to the person that we ought to be. And we're just constantly in search of that center. And we know that we can always come back to it if and when we deviate. In terms of what happens after we die, we talk about the creation story where God, scoops up a mound of earth, Adamah, and breathes a soul into it so that Adamah becomes Adam. It's the same etymology, the same Hebrew word. And so when we die, our soul and our body separate once again. Our soul returns to God, and our body, we return to the earth, which is why Jews bury our dead. And of course we visit our loved ones in the cemetery. We mark their yard site, which means the anniversary of their death. And we have a service called Yizkor, which means remembrance, that we incorporate into our holidays throughout the year so that the memories of our loved ones are always present with us. And we hope that Olam Haba, in the world to come, that we'll have a good experience. We'll be able to be reunited with our loved ones, etc. But we don't place a lot of weight on that. We're really all about this life.
It makes sense. In Christianity, I've heard some people say things like, well, it doesn't matter what I do now because I'm looking forward to what comes next. And, as a sort of a Christian scholar, I would say, no, that's not the point of it. The point of the things you do now is so that you can have an abundant life, an abundant walk with God now. And so while your eye is on eternity, you have to always be present in what you're doing now and how you're living now and what you're making of your life at this point in time. And so it's encouraging to know that that in conservative Judaism, people are very concerned not just with the end, but also with the whole journey and where they're at currently in the journey. Well, I think the last sort of, I guess, question I'll have for you today is with regard to ethical beliefs, what are some maybe important ethical topics today in conservative Judaism for our culture and sort of where we're at in the world?
Okay, well, I'll start with our belief that every single person is created in God's image.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like one of the most important ethical beliefs of Judaism, that we are not more important or less important than any other person on earth. If we're really going to believe and internalize that belief that we're all created in God's image, we have to truly live that way, each and every day of our lives. In terms of, ethical conversations that are coming up in this day and age, what you'll find in our most modern halachic writings, those responsa that I was talking about before, is, issues of abortion, issues of euthanasia, how it is that in a pandemic that we can still pray together. I mentioned before that there are certain prayers we can only pray when we have a quorum present together. Does that mean a physical quorum in a room together, or does that mean 10 screens on Zoom? So these are just some of the different conversations that we're having. And of course, you alluded to our political climate right now. I happen to serve in a community that's pretty purple. We're very mixed. And so, you see a lot of religious leaders on the left or on the right getting up in front of their communities and talking about supporting either one political party or another, or one political approach or another. And a lot of the sacred work that we found over the last many years, but especially over the last year, has been around, the question of what does the word sanctuary mean in a modern religious context? And you already know what I'm talking about. Like, is a sanctuary supposed to protect you from the outside world, or is a sanctuary supposed to give you a place where you can process what's going on in the outside world? Where talking about politics isn't taboo, but can actually help you do it. We can actually help you do it in a safe space where you know that you're going to be loved and held and listened to, even by people that disagree. And that's been really hard that kind of space is really hard to hold, because, if you can imagine a microcosm of our country's political climate, everybody likes to stay in their echo chamber. Nobody likes to hear an opposing view.
Mm-hmm.
I think some of the most important religious work of this day, not just in Jewish communities, but I think all over, is going to be how it is that clergy can help support these spaces where our congregants can all be together, can understand that they're part of sacred community, and can disagree.
Yeah.
And know that that's safe and fine, and we can still love each other and celebrate together and mourn together and all the things. And that our political identities are just part of who we are.
Yeah, very good. That's very similar in Christianity. A lot of churches are very purple as well, and you'll have people that are, I'm a one issue voter, and that puts me in this category, and other people say, I want to look at our culture on the whole, and I'm going to vote in light of that. And when we come together as a church, our unity is that we are all there in the same faith and with understanding of the same spiritual beliefs. And regardless of, how we are, on the other places, we should be able to come together unified under our faith, and then allow that to sort of shape how we then communicate about all the other aspects of life together, so that those things don't become more important than our relationship with the Lord, which is a more important thing in general. So.
Right. I mean, what we try to do is, instead of talking about it from an aspect of policy, is we try to talk about it from values.
Yeah.
And how can we get people back to, being able to articulate the values that animate them? And sometimes it's the same value, but it's manifest into polar opposite ways. But at least we can still, unite around the values, that Judaism and religion give us as we come into the world.
Yeah. Very nice. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a great honor to talk to you and a joy to have you here. And so I wish you all the best. And I just want to say once again, thank you so much for your time and for allowing us to learn a little bit about your beliefs and a little bit about your culture.
And thanks so much for the invitation. It's been a pleasure. Thank
Yeah,
you so
well, we'll see you next time on Faith and Culture Now.